Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Joyfully Imperfect show for highly driven women. Welcome back after the summer break. It's been 2 months since our last episode, and I am so excited to be back with you. I'm your host, Yukti Rao, and this summer has been really interesting. But before I dive into it, I wanted to say a few things. Firstly, my apologies. As I was leaving for summer and as I recorded the last episode, my intention was to leave you with some uh, interviews I had done earlier last year with these incredible, inspiring women in my Woman Know Thyself Summit. And my intention was actually to provide those interviews and roll them out while I was in the summer. Unfortunately, I fell sick and a number of things happened. I did not have the bandwidth or the energy to actually complete the process and get it ready to roll out while I was out. So, in the interest of integrity, I wanted to bring it up and apologize for not being able to do that. Sometimes life happens, your body needs help, and things happen. And we'll talk more about integrity in another episode because this really inspired some thought for me. But I just wanted to come and say that. And I do intend to roll out those interviews, at least some of them, based on permissions granted. And over the course of the year, interspersed in between our episodes. And guess what? I will be bringing in more interviews coming up in September. For August, I have an interesting plan laid out for you guys, and there's some interesting stuff coming up. And of course, even as inspiration strikes, things change. I'm always ready to roll with it because that's what makes it interesting to have these conversations with you guys. And I'd love to hear more from you guys about topics that interest you or what's going on in your life. So that inspires me to create topics that interest you. So today we're actually going to talk about inspiration. Inspiration and motivation. What are they and how they are different? So let me start with a personal story because this helps me connect and it will help you see why I see them as different things and how they're different, at least in my view. And I'd love to hear from you what your view is as well. So, as summer ended, my intention was really to come back to podcasting about 5 to 6 weeks after into summer. I figured after coming back from vacation, I'd have time to settle down and take care of and come back. Well, life didn't quite work out that way. I have had guests all summer, and and I wanted to give you guys undivided attention. But then I started hitting a roadblock because guess what? I want to come back with the perfect topic at the perfect time in the perfect environment. All my perfectionist tendencies started to come in, and I kept delaying it and delaying it and delaying it. And to be honest, I about 2 weeks ago is when I intended to finally record, and I did not do it. Guess what? The motivation wasn't there. I wasn't feeling motivated enough, and my perfectionism started to get in the way, and I started procrastinating and avoiding doing even something that I feel inspired about and I love doing. So, why does that happen to us? I'm sure as humans, all of us go through this, right? You guys have probably gone through it. Maybe you can identify with what I'm saying here. But what I realized is that even when you're inspired, sometimes it's hard to motivate yourself. And most of the time when you're motivated, if you're not inspired, after a while, the motivation runs out. So what do you guys think about that? What is the difference between inspiration and motivation? Let's dive into it. Let's start with a little technical stuff. I'm going to refer to my notes here. So inspiration, how it's defined, is a divine influence or action onto a person believed to receive sacred guidance. It's a feeling of, it could be a feeling of enthusiasm or simply being like driven in our case, like, oh, this feels like the right direction towards doing something or towards doing something which creates this creative ideas and creates creative action. So inspiration is very much internally driven, the way I see it, whether it's driven, those who believe in God or in source or whatever you call it, believe it, you can call it sacred guidance, you can call it inner guidance, like coming from your heart, from your soul, different. So that's how I see inspiration. That's what inspires me. For me, Joyfully Imperfect was, this podcast was definitely inspired. It came from somewhere within me, this need to come out and speak to you guys. This is me expressing my truth in a way that I hope gives you the freedom and the awareness also to know your truth and then actually speak it into the world. That's what inspired me to come and speak. What works for me, I want to share with you, so it hopefully works for you. And if you feel inspired, maybe it will inspire new ideas, new things for you to actually create in your life. It doesn't have to look like a podcast. It can be any kind of creation. It can be a dish you create, a note you write, a phone call you make, some artwork you do. Creation as such is not just creation as in what we think about, oh, these are creative artists. No, we are always, all of us, creating stuff. So inspiration is what inspires us from within to create something. And what is motivation? Motivation is defined as the reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. It's like a driving force that initiates, guides, and maintains us to be to work towards certain goals. And as highly driven people, we are generally pretty goal oriented. That's how we've lived our life, most of our life. But often those goals are externally focused or externally driven. So motivation is something that comes from outside of you, usually. Now, both are necessary in life, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But having heard these definitions, I want you to actually take a moment and ponder what inspires you. What is an example in your life that you can think of where you felt inspired to do something and you took action and got this sense of fulfillment almost? Fulfillment is the right word that I find works for me. It often gives me a sense of purpose and also drives passion. But passion can burn out faster and fulfillment lasts longer. But just telling you that. And what motivates you? Okay, on a daily basis, what motivates you to keep going? What are some of the things that you do to keep yourself motivated? Because inspiration is often more an inside game, like something that comes from your heart and soul, and motivation is something that you do drive through your mindset as well. Now, really, that's why the coming together of both of these is so important. And I'll share some examples from my life to talk about where I've felt inspired and where I felt motivated. I've already shared an example about inspiration with this podcast, how it inspires me. But what ended up happening was the inspiration was still there in the summer, but I lost the motivation because I no longer had this external drive that, you know what? I have people waiting for me. That wasn't enough motivation for me. I got lost in that. I didn't have clear goals defined as to that I had to be back by a certain time. So there were not enough external factors motivating me to show up here in mid-July instead of beginning of August like I am. Let's be honest. So I'm being very candid with you. Um, and it's extremely vulnerable for me to actually admit it, because the perfectionist in me is like kicking my butt and saying, why the heck are you saying this? But it's the truth. So what inspires you and what motivates you? Okay, look in your life and see where you felt inspired and you acted on it and how you felt. And there are places where you felt inspired and you've not acted on it and what it makes you feel like. And see if there are places where inspiration has created the motivation to drive you. And there are places where you've motivated yourself and driven yourself. And how have you felt about it? Okay. So those are the questions that I'm asking you to ponder on, and pause it if you want. Pause the podcast if you have a moment, if you're not driving or walking while listening to it, and write it down. Or if you're driving or walking, pause it and do some introspection. Think about it while I share how inspiration and motivation have driven me through certain parts of my life. Okay. And I'll give some examples. Maybe they will help you think and process your own. So when I look back, for example, and I talked to even my friends, and they were like, you were very clear about your path at a very young age. Like in fourth, fifth grade, before I was 10 years old, I was like, I'm going to be an engineer. So when I look back, I was very clear, very focused, very goal oriented, and worked towards that goal clearly and in a very targeted way. I went and did my bachelor's in engineering in India, and then did my master's here. And after doing my bachelor's, I was very focused on coming here and doing my master's and working in the US, because I thought the job work was more interesting. At that time, it may have been, it may not have been, but that was my understanding. Now the world is a different place, and there's just interesting, really, really interesting work going on all over the world, is how I see it. But in any case, the point was that I had a goal. I was very focused on it. Did it come from a place of inspiration or motivation? That is what I'm driving at. It sounds like I was very motivated to get it done for a very long time, for many, many years, for over 10 years, right? Over a decade of just driving towards that one ultimate goal. Now that I have grown up, I have gone through my changes and all the stuff, I realized that it was more a motivation, because it was externally driven. The reason I wanted to be an engineer was because my dad was an engineer. I looked up to him. He was somebody whose example I wanted to follow. And so I have a very logical mind. I was good at math and physics. So automatically it seemed like that was the clear path. So maybe there was some level of inspiration, in the sense, the underlying subjects interested me. It wasn't something that I found boring and difficult to do. So it was a clear path. So there was some inspiration, but as far as my focus was concerned, it was very externally motivated. So that was a motivated thing. Now, as I went through life, I made different changes in my work. One of the changes I made was I moved from purely engineering to being in sales, applications, and marketing. And that was also somewhat externally driven, but also internally driven. How was that the case? When I look back and I look at my motivation at that time, I was motivated to be an engineer, but I didn't know what it was like to work as an engineer. So after about doing that for a couple of years, I realized that for me, what inspired me was actually interacting with people and learning what they wanted and then delivering solutions. I'm still doing that. So that was my inspiration to look for a change in the environment I was currently in, to find a place where I felt more motivated to deliver the results that I wanted to deliver. Because as an engineer, guess what was happening? I was petering out. I wasn't that interested. I was delivering on the work, but I wasn't interested in the work. So that impacts your work. It impacts how you show up at work. Thankfully for me, the direction happened quickly and I shifted quickly. So that was inspiration driving the motivation to create change. And then, lo and behold, over many years, the inspiration dried out. And I actually burnt out because I did not listen to my inspiration. I tried to keep motivating myself to push through at work when it wasn't inspiring me at all. And some of you may be able to identify with that. And for various reasons, and I'll go over that in a different episode when I'm going to specifically talk about burnout and how people can see the signs of it way before it happens, and how corporations can actually do something to elevate that for the employees. So that's my plan for August. So listen in, keep listening in for more tips and more information on that. But burnout often happens when you lose the inspiration and you keep motivating yourself through mindset, through oh, it's needed in life, I need the money. There could be so many different reasons. I can't leave my job, feeling stuck, all those things. When you lose inspiration and all you're doing is using your motivation and your goals or what you see ahead to drive you alone, that's not enough. So I'm inviting you to look at, that's why I'm asking you to look at yourself, say what inspires you and how does that inspiration drive your motivation to set goals and achieve what you want to. I'm not even a big believer in goals anymore, but they do help me stay on track sometimes. But we'll talk, that's a conversation for another time. So having said that, that life led me into a completely different inspired path. And I have been doing coaching and being an entrepreneur for over 5 years now. And now it's actually inspiring me to take these two worlds. I mean, it's inspired me now to take to these worlds and work with all these highly driven people in corporate world, right? To create change there. And that's what inspires me. And with that inspiration, I still need the motivation to show up daily, to show up fully, and be present with whatever's happening, be it working with a client, doing the back office stuff, or showing up on the podcast or on videos to talk to you. So that is why being inspired and motivation go hand in hand. So now when I'm inspired, when I can tap into my inspiration that I am here to create a solution and help drive it to people like me who've gotten this experience of being in the corporate world, maybe reaching burnout or being close to burnout, or inspired to create change in the dynamics of how leaders in the corporate world are working and inspiring their teams and motivating their teams. Okay. That really drives me. That's the inspiration. And from that, I find the motivation to do daily tasks and work towards certain goals. Okay. So that's what inspiration and motivation means for me from a working perspective. So I've given you how it works in my life, in one arena of my life. Now you can actually use this example to see how it works in different arenas of your life. It could be in your finances, how you show up. It could be with your family, your friends, in your relationships. But right now, we're using the work to see how it drives. Because if your motivation, you could have the motivation to make an X amount of money so you can retire, for example. But if there's no inspiration behind it, you will find it hard to stay consistently motivated. You'll go back and forth. And often it will leave you feeling depleted and maybe even go towards burnout. So that's why being inspired and then creating motivation through inspiration is so important. So I've already shared examples of why inspiration is important. But what if inspiration exists and there's no motivation? That happens to many of us. There are so many examples. I can tell you an example. My daughter had a leaky gut, and I helped, I studied what to do and how to help her. Like I was doing my PhD. I didn't actually go and study in a school, but I studied like that, and I know enough. So I had the inspiration before I went into this type of coaching to actually become a health coach and work in that arena and that industry. But that inspiration was while I was still doing my corporate job, and I could not motivate myself enough because I'd already lost inspiration in something I was doing on a daily basis. I could not motivate myself enough to take the action steps needed because I was physically tired to drive that inspiration and motivate myself to create what I was being inspired to do. So, inspiration without motivation can lead to nothing as well. So, I invite you to see where you're feeling inspired and not acting on it, or not able to act on it, and why, and where you are feeling inspired and not feeling motivated, and why is that? All right. So I've given you guys a lot to think about in terms of inspiration and motivation, how they're different, how they actually go hand in hand. To find success at something, to actually drive towards something, and do so consistently and stay with it, you need both inspiration and motivation. That has really been my discovery through the end of the summer, because I had the inspiration but not the motivation. And I discovered, and earlier on I had the motivation but not the inspiration, and that didn't work. So I always thought inspiration, if I was inspired, I'd still keep, it would be easier to show up. But inspiration alone is not enough. Taking action, being motivated to take that action is critical. So if you have dreams and desires that are coming through, that you're inspired to fulfill, you still have to motivate yourself to take one single step every day so you can actually bring what you're inspired to bring to life. So I invite you to do that, even as I am trying to do that by showing up for you every week in Joyfully Imperfect, to showcase what comes up. Like I said, more interesting thing coming up in August. We'll be talking about burnout. We'll be having some interviews show up in the next couple of months with some experts. And I am going to please share this podcast with all the people you know who will benefit from it, men and women, because I'm inspired now to change the topic of this podcast to Joyfully Imperfect for Highly Driven People, because a number of men I have worked with and I've shared these episodes with have said that a lot of this material is relevant to them as well, and they would that I should change the name. So I'm inspired to do so. All right, more coming up in the month of August. I look forward to talking to you. If you wish to work with me, reach out. You can find all that information in the show notes below. You can check me out at yukti.net. Thank you for listening. See ya next week.